The phrase class warfare has been coming up a lot in recent months. It seems that the charge is leveled against any public official who speaks honestly about the economic realities facing millions of Americans. Noam Chomsky says it's the corporations who are waging that war, and their targets are working people in this country and around the world. Chomsky is a professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is considered a leading intellectual of our time. Here's an excerpt of a recent speech he gave at Harvard University at a day-long conference organized by Jobs with Justice. His speech is called The Corporate War on Working People.
Well, there are four sort of obvious topics to discuss, and I'll try to say something about each of them. One is the question, what kinds of social policy are being designed and applied to the American population right around now? Two, what are the likely consequences of these policies? Three, why is it now, not let's say 30 years ago? And four, what can we do about it? Well, the first one, what kinds of policies are being designed, they have a name, although it's not usually applied here. They're a variant of what is sometimes called the Washington Consensus, or structural adjustment, or neoliberalism, or various other similar names. These are the policies that are rammed down the throats of the most of the third world. That includes now the restored third world in Eastern Europe. And the policies of the Washington Consensus are first to reduce the size of government. It's called fiscal conservatism or something like that. Have small balanced budgets, cut public expenditures, social spending, health, education. The general principle is cut any use of public funds to benefit the public. I mean, that's the essential principle number one. You give it various fancy names, but that's what it comes down to. The second feature of the Washington Consensus is to make the tax system more regressive. It's already very regressive. So, for example, in the United States, it's been flat for years, but the idea is to make it more regressive. So, for example, as applied to the United States, I'm saying in the third world, as applied to the United States, the next big thing online is to reduce taxes on financial gains. That's about half the income for the top 1% of the population, and obviously declining very fast as you move down the wealth level. Third part of the Washington Consensus is deregulation. Fourth part is privatization. Fifth part is stronger government guarantees. The Washington Consensus involves both strengthening and weakening government. It's stronger government guarantees for property rights. The sixth part is reduction of trade barriers. Well, I'll come back to what those mean. But the general consequences are reasonably clear. If you take a look at the third world, you see the general consequences. One consequence is that the designers of the experiment, namely the designers of the Washington Consensus, the IMF, the World Bank, the major transnational corporations that lie behind them and so on, the designers of the experiment come out doing very, very well. They gain very greatly from the experiment. Actually, that's about as near to a universal principle as history provides. These experiments go back hundreds of years, and I have yet to find one where the designers didn't come out very, very well off. That's kind of like an accident, which you're not supposed to notice. What about the experimental animals, who are very rarely asked for permission? Well, they tend to do very badly. In the third world, it's a little nuanced. There's a small sector, namely those who cooperate with the experiment. They do very well too. So a typical third world country has a small sector of the population which lives in extraordinary wealth and opulence, and they're kind of connected with the ongoing experiments, and they're the ones who write the articles and the books and so on, so they think it's all great and they advocate it and so on. For the rest of the population, outside of a small sector, this runs across any third world society you look at, They live somewhere between suffering and misery. Some depends on the society. Most of them, it's closer to misery. And as the experiments proceed, it gets closer and closer to that. Then there's another part of the population which is simply superfluous. I mean, they don't contribute anything to wealth creation, and you got to do something with them. Like if it's, say, Colombia, which gets half of U.S. military aid for the hemisphere and has the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, then what you do with them is send out the military forces or the paramilitary forces to murder them. They're called disposable people. In other places, you do it in various other different ways. But somehow you just get rid of them. So that's a typical third world society, a small sector of great wealth, a large mass of the population and facing one or another problem from down to misery, and then disposable people. That's fairly uniform. And that's been a uniform consequence of these experiments, which incidentally have been going on for hundreds of years. So the general principle is designers do great, the ones who cooperate with them do great, the experimental animals only by accident do they gain anything. Mostly they suffer quite a bit. One standard consequence of contemporary structural adjustment programs, in fact universal, is that the share of labor in national income declines. That's a regular property of them. Well, this again is something you're not supposed to notice. It just sort of happens. Incidentally, another thing that happens is after the experiments are over, like some years down the road, there's a kind of an analysis, and they're called a failure. For some strange reason, they failed. Although oddly, they always succeeded in something that might be thought of as success, namely enriching the designers and the people who collaborated with them. They're called a failure for everyone else on a tacit assumption, which is that everything the rich and powerful people do is only designed for the benefit of everyone. How could it be otherwise? Because we're so perfect. So therefore, since it seemed to harm everyone, it must have been a failure, and just by accident it benefited us and our collaborators. Well, actually, I know a lot of your students, so if there happens to be somebody who's looking for a really good dissertation topic, one where you know the answer in advance, that's the best kind. All I have to do is fill in the details. And one that has another predictable outcome, you'll never get a job. If you want a topic like that, then what you might do is do a study of the experiments that have been carried out, say starting with the British permanent settlement in India in 1793, and going up to, say, USAID's project of turning Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean in the 1980s, or the shock therapy in, say, Bolivia or Eastern Europe. Just run through the whole series and find out and just check off how many times this consequence fails. Consequence, great for the designers, great for the collaborators, disaster for the experimental animals, a wrap-up later which says, gee, we don't understand it, but it seems to have failed. That's the job of the academics and intellectuals and so on. Interesting topic. I'd leave it to you. Well, point is that these policies are by no means new. I mean, it's now called the Washington Consensus, but one or another variety of it's been going on for hundreds of years. If you go back to the 18th century, what is today the first world and the third world were much more similar than they are now, far more. You can argue about the reasons for the split, but I don't think there's very much doubt that one of the reasons for the split, and probably a rather significant element in it, was that neoliberal programs of one or another variety were forced on what is now the third world, while the first world adhered to strong protectionism, powerful state to protect the wealthy for the most part, but often much of the population from market discipline and so on. That split is certainly a factor. You could argue how much. I would think a major factor in leading to this very sharp difference. Classic example is Britain and India, first big case. India was the manufacturing center of the world from, say, 1600 to 1800. It was deindustrialized by force. The British forced on it what are now called neoliberal policies. and it turned it into a backward, ruralized, impoverished country, and that's been replicated elsewhere. So, for example, in Europe, Germany developed exactly the same way: high protectionism, state intervention, and so on. Same is true of France and Italy. If you look outside of Europe, and pretty much the rest of Europe, you go outside of Europe, there are two areas of the world that have developed, namely the two that resisted European colonization. One is the United States. After the colonies freed themselves from British colonization, they were able to follow the British model. In fact, even more intensively, the United States was the model of the interventionist, protectionist, developmental state. Tariffs way higher than anybody else. Powerful state intervention to keep cotton cheap by massacring the indigenous population and bringing in slaves. That's incidentally not usually included in economic history for some reason, though it's plainly a kind of a market interference of a rather serious sort. And so it goes from textiles to steel and on to computers and electronics and aviation and the rest of it. That's the United States. Out the other area that developed was Japan, which also resisted European colonization and then followed pretty much the same direction that Europe and the United States did, with some of its colonies in tow. That's a pretty general principle. The parts of the world that were able to develop were those that were able to protect themselves from the neoliberal model that's imposed on everyone else. Just if you look at the details, it's even more, it becomes even more clear. Okay, that's pretty much the history, I think you'll find. And coming back to what's happening here, we're getting there is something new going on. What's new that's going on is now these policies are also being applied in a certain sense to the industrial societies themselves. For those who are interested in the real world, a look at the actual history suggests an adjustment, a modification of free market theory to what we might call really existing free market theory. That is the one that's actually applied, not talked about. And the principle of really existing free market theory is free markets are fine for you, but not for me. That's, again, near a universal. So you, whoever you may be, you have to learn responsibility and be subjected to market discipline. It's good for your character, it's tough love, and so on and so forth. But me, I need the nanny state to protect me from market discipline so that I'll be able to rant and rave about the marvels of the free market while I'm getting properly subsidized and defended by everyone else through the nanny state. And also, this has to be risk-free. So I'm perfectly willing to make profits, but I don't want to take risks. If anything goes wrong, you bail me out. Okay. So if third world debt gets out of control, you socialize it. It's not the problem of the banks that made the money. When the S&Ls collapse, same thing. Public bails them out. When American investment firms get into trouble because the Mexican bubble bursts, you bail out Goldman Sachs. And the Mexico bailout, and on and on. I mean, there's case after case of this. In fact, of the top 100 leading transnationals in the Fortune list of transnationals, there was a recent study of how they related to the states in which they're all somewhere, so they're all mostly here in some national state. It turns out that all 100 of them had benefited from industrial policies, meaning state intervention in their behalf. All 100 had benefited from the state in which they're based, and 20 of the 100 had been saved from total disaster, that is collapse, by just state bailout. When people talk about globalization of the economy, remember that the nanny state has to be very powerful in order to bail out the rich, and nothing is changing in that regard. 20 out of 100, again, were saved from collapse by this, including a number here. Well, that's really existing free market theory. There are many examples of it quite close to home, so we could start with our own governor, Governor Weld. who's described by the Boston Globe as a libertarian with a religious belief in free markets. And then a couple of days later, they reported that through various scams, his administration was able to sharply increase federal subsidies to Massachusetts so that way beyond what they were before, so that he could parade as a fiscal conservative. And that's pretty common. Just a year before, you may recall, if you have long memories, they had to close George's Bank, the richest fishing area in the world, because it was being overfished thanks to a combination of deregulation and subsidies to the fishing industry, which have that odd consequence that you tend to get overfishing. So it looked as if the ground fish were wiped out and they had to close it off. It didn't take long for the religious libertarian fanatic William Well to take the next jet plane down to Washington, hat in hand, asking for a federal bailout. He wanted the national federal government to declare it a natural disaster. And the reason was, as he explained, with presumably some scientists in tow, that there was some strange kind of predatory fish, which no one had yet found, but they would find it, don't worry. So some kind of predatory fish had come and sort of wiped out all the, the cod and the haddock and all those things. So it was a natural disaster, and therefore the general public had to sort of pay off the results of deregulation and subsidizing the fishing industry. Well, that's the way to be a libertarian with religious fervor. Another one is the leader of the conservative revolution, Newt Gingrich. Nobody's more passionate about the market than he is, in particular about his own district, which he calls a Norman Rockwell world of jet planes and fiber optics, as indeed it is, except if you ask where jet planes and fiber optics came from, you discover that the public paid for them and still pays for them. And in fact, he manages to get more federal subsidies for his district than any suburban county in the country outside the federal system. So you can have conservatism flowering among the malls and so on. Or you can go back to the Reaganites, who are also very passionate about free markets for everyone else. Meanwhile, they boasted to the American business community correctly that they had done more, that they had instituted more protection than any post-war American administration, in fact, more than all of them combined. They had doubled import restrictions, blocking and helped and poured public funds into major industries to enable them to recapitalize, to protect, in fact, reconstruct the steel industry and the automotive industry and the semiconductors and so on, which would have disappeared if they'd opened the markets. The Thatcherites in England were about the same. Government expenditures relative to GNP stayed pretty constant, although anything that went to the general population collapsed. Meanwhile, military industry shot up, arms sales are booming. That's all publicly subsidized stuff. Arms sales to nice guys like Saddam Hussein and General Suharto and others. Well, that's really existing free market theory.
Noam Chomsky is professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His speech, given at a day-long conference organized by Jobs with Justice, is called The Corporate War on Working People. As members of Congress led by Newt Gingrich are currently fighting for an increase in military spending, we turn to a recent speech of MIT professor Noam Chomsky. He talks about how the U.S. budget is looking increasingly like the structural adjustment programs the U.S. imposes on developing countries.
The Washington Consensus, which is basically designed for the third world to make it that way and keep it that way, it's now being applied not just to the third world countries, but to the rich industrial societies, with the United States and Britain in the lead. However, it's with a twist. Since it's being applied at home, this is really existing free market theory that's being applied at home, meaning nuanced. So powerful government to protect the rich and market discipline and tough love for everyone else. And you see that very clearly. Go through the various elements of the Washington Consensus that I mentioned. The first one is about reducing government. Well, that's false. We're not reducing government. We're shifting it around. So social spending is indeed way down since the 1970s when this stuff started, accelerated after 1980, but it was starting in the mid-70s. The kind of a benchmark example is AFDC, the main support system. That was cut virtually in half from about 1970 to 1990, with obvious effects on poor families and children and so on. It was part of a general war against women and children that was conducted by the conservatives under the name of family values. It's interesting that they were able to get away with that. That tells you something about the intellectual culture. Well, one part was the reduction of AFDC by roughly half from about 1970 to about 1990. It's now essentially gone. Purpose of that, as you know, is so that 7 million, a couple of million, I think 5 or 6 million kids, average 7 years old, can learn responsibility. That's part of tough love. Meanwhile, another part of the government has been very stable and, in fact, is going up, namely the Pentagon system, which remains at approximately Cold War levels. In fact, it's higher now than it was under Nixon, although the big enemy has disappeared, which tells you exactly how much, tells a rational person at least, exactly how much they were worried about the Russian threat. Not only does it remain at Cold War levels, but it's going up under the initiative of the fiscal conservatives. The Heritage Foundation, which, sort of the right-wing foundation that designs the budget for the Gingrich Army, are calling for an increase in the Pentagon system, as is Gingrich, as indeed was Clinton. So that goes up. And I should say that cutting of social spending, social spending is being cut very sharply, very much over public opposition. At the time of the 1994 congressional election, the big landslide, over 60% of the public wanted social spending to increase. Okay, went very sharply down. What about Pentagon spending going up? Well, this public is 6-to-1 opposed to that, which gives you one aspect of a big picture about what's happening to American democracy. I mean, somewhat of a change, not a huge change. So one part of the system is going up, Pentagon spending. Another part's going down, social spending. And the same is true in other domains. Like, for example, legal aid for the poor is being slashed and virtually destroyed. On the other hand, the security system, the government security system, state and federal, that's going up. So prisons are going way up. The prison population, crime hasn't changed for about 20 years. And incidentally, U.S. crime rates are not off the spectrum, contrary to what a lot of people believe. Crime rates are sort of toward the high end of the industrial world, but not off the spectrum, with one exception, namely murder with guns. But that's a special feature of American society, which doesn't have to do with crime rates. Apart from that, crime rates are kind of toward the high end, not going up. The prison population tripled during the Reagan years, is going up even faster now. And I think the reason is another aspect of the third world model, namely the superfluous population. There is a big superfluous population. They don't contribute to wealth protection. Well, we're civilized folks. We're not like the people we fund in Colombia who go out and murder them, so we throw them into jail. And that's going way up in even more. And there's also a kind of like a side benefit to this. The putting more and more people in jail, and in fact under harsher and harsher conditions, is a technique of social control for everybody else. I mean, when someday down the road you decide to run a dictatorship and you want to really harm people, it's kind of like Hitler Germany or something. You know that you're going to carry out policies that are going to cause people a lot of harm. You got to control them somehow, and there aren't many ways to do it. Everyone hits on the same ways. What you do is engender fear and hatred, and make them hate the guy who looks a little different or whatever it may be. And then you punish those bad guys because they're really awful, and you punish them really hard and so on, and that makes people even more frightened. You can just see that happening right around you. And building up the perception of crime. Crime has what they call in literary theory a subtext. You're supposed to understand criminal has the little word black in front of it, just like welfare mother, black, rich black. welfare mother. And criminal means, that black guy is coming after you. So what you want to do is, this has the dual effect of getting rid of a superfluous population, basically unskilled workers, close race-class correlation, and also demonizing them, so everybody else is scared and frightened, and they'll be willing to accept what's happening to them too and not look at where the source is. So that part of the drug wars, basically, for this has almost nothing to do with drugs, but it has plenty to do with criminalizing an unwanted population and scaring everybody else. And so does the harshening of prison conditions, which is really, the United States is off the map on this one, in violation of international conventions, constantly condemned in human rights forums, and getting much worse. The reinstitution of chain gangs was, of course, bitterly condemned, but that's that bad South. Alabama, well, it's now in Illinois. The state Senate of Illinois, last week or two ago, legislated chain gangs, not for violent criminals, incidentally, for people who are found with drugs or, robbed a store or something like that. The Chicago Press pointed out that this carries this kind of reminiscent of slavery. But the legislator and the state senator who put it through said that this is just another aspect of what he called tough love. And then he explained that some people work better under humiliation. So it's really good to restore elements of slavery. And again, the subtext is everybody else gets scared. If those guys have to walk around like slaves in chains, we must be in real danger, so therefore we'll accept what's happening to us. That's the logic. So prisons are going up, and that has a lot of side benefits, apart from just getting rid of the superfluous population. It is a source of cheap labor, so prison labor is going way up. Cheap labor, you don't have to worry about unions, no benefits, they don't get out of line. And that also naturally undercuts wages elsewhere. So just like forcing welfare mothers to work, raising children isn't work, as anybody knows who's had children. So you have to drive them to work, kind of like people who go to, Fidelity Investment to figure out scams about how to deal with the security market. You really want these people to work. But since there's no jobs for them, they're going to work at low-paid or publicly subsidized wages, which will undercut other wages. And the same with prison labor. In fact, the scale of prison construction, which is a kind of Keynesian stimulus to the economy anyway, but its scale has become so enormous that even high-tech industry, the guys who are usually just ripping off the Pentagon system, they're beginning to look at it, figuring out, recognizing that high-tech surveillance devices and so on may be another way to sort of get the transfer of public funds to make sure that high-tech industry keeps moving. It's not the scale of the Pentagon, but it's going up. Well, that's one aspect of what's called reducing government, modifying government, to be more precise. Another aspect of it is what's called devolution, moving governmental power from the federal to the state level. And that has a kind of a rationale which you hear all over the place. For example, there was an op-ed a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times by John Cogan of Hoover Institute at Stanford, who pointed out what he called a philosophical issue that divides the Democrats and the Republicans. The philosophical issue is that the Democrats believe in big government and entitlement, and the Republicans believe in getting power down closer to the people, to the states, because they're kind of populist types. Well, it takes about maybe 3 seconds thought to realize that moving power down to the states in funding and so on is just moving it away from the people for a perfectly elementary reason. There's a hidden part of the system, of the power system, that you're not supposed to know about or think about, and that's private power. Now, it takes a big corporation like, say, General Electric or Microsoft to sort of pressure the federal government, but even middle-sized guys have no problems with state governments. They can control them quite easily. And in case anyone was too dull to figure this out by themselves, the same day as Cogan's op-ed in the New York Times, which is a typical one, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal about Massachusetts, which had a headline that read, what Fidelity Investment wants, it usually gets. Okay. And then the story went on to say that Fidelity Investment, the biggest investment firm in Massachusetts, wanted even more subsidy and support from the state government that it already gets, and it was threatening if it didn't, it would move over the border to Rhode Island, where it just owns the place. So therefore, the passionately libertarian governor quickly rearranged, tax subsidies and one thing or another, so that Fidelity got what it wanted. Well, Fidelity couldn't have done that with the federal government. Couldn't have said, you give us even more, we're going to move to Switzerland or something. I mean, other guys can do it maybe, but not Fidelity. Raytheon, which is the biggest manufacturing producer, did the same thing. Raytheon, incidentally, Fidelity it's not that Fidelity is poor. They just announced record profits a couple of days ago. Same with Raytheon, just announced record profits, but having big problems. So they wanted even a bigger tax subsidy and direct subsidy and tax write-offs, which just means transfer of taxes from the state of Massachusetts. And they threatened if they didn't get them, they were going to go to Tennessee. So of course they got them. The legislature passed a special law giving what they call defense industry special extra subsidies. Notice that Raytheon is publicly subsidized in the first place. That's where its money comes from. But now it has to be additionally subsidized so that its profits will be even higher than the record profits it just made. Same with Fidelity. And that's the kind of game anybody can, even way down the much smaller businesses can play with states. So moving devolution, the consequences of devolution are quite straightforward. It means that any funding that goes, say, block grants that go to the states, you can be reasonably confident that they'll end up in the deep pockets of rich people, not, in the hands of hungry children or poor mothers or anything like that. That's how you get power down to the people. Okay, that's devolution. In fact, quite generally, when you look at it, what's called government cutting is more or less cost transfer. It's almost never reduction. Sometimes it's increase. So let's take take health reform. Reform is a word you always ought to watch out for. Like when Mao started the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't called a reform. Reform is a change that you're supposed to like. Okay. And watch. So as soon as you hear the word reform, you kind of reach for your wallet and see who's lifting it. Anyhow, there are things called health reforms. And the health reforms are supposed to, cut government costs. Well, they do cut one kind of cost, but of course they raise another kind of cost. And furthermore, it's no big secret. So like the Wall Street Journal had a headline which pointed out that when the reforms were, moving through Congress, it said rich gain, poor lose, trade-offs for the middle class. Okay. Which is right. That's exactly what the reforms are intended to do. You have to remember, by middle class, they mean the people right below the very rich. So they don't mean the median. They're not talking about people with $30,000 a year income. They mean so what it really means is great for the rich, super rich, trade-offs for the near rich, tough business, tough love for everybody else, which is most everyone. When you close public hospitals and that sort of thing, you know exactly who's going to suffer. Well, let's go to what are called, take say New York, which has a conservative governor and a conservative mayor, and they're carrying out very extensive conservative tax cuts because they're fiscal conservatives. The tax cuts, the New York Times pointed out in a small item, all benefit business. So by accident, all the tax cuts benefit business. Well, there are also tax increases, which are compensating for the tax cuts, but they don't call them tax increases. What they call them is, the phrase is reduction of subsidies for public transportation and for tuition in public universities. Well, subsidy itself is another interesting word, kind of like reform. It's a subsidy if public funds are used for public purposes. That's called a subsidy. It's not called a subsidy when they go to private wealth. That's reform or something. So they're cutting down subsidies for public transportation. Well, that's just a tax. If you pay 20% more to getting on the subway, that's tax. Same if you pay higher tuition at City College, and that's a highly regressive tax. So who rides the subways and who goes to City College? So what they're doing is cutting taxes for business, for the rich, and increasing taxes for the poor, which are going to compensate for that. And that's called fiscal conservatism.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky, America's leading progressive intellectual, speaking recently at an all-day forum at Harvard University sponsored by Jobs for Justice. The speech was recorded by Chuck Rosina of WMBR in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And if you know of an interesting speech coming up, why don't you record it or let us know about it? We'll give the number at the end of the show. I'm Amy Goodman. You're listening to Democracy Now!